Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. At 23, she worked as a junior administrative assistant at Fort Henderson, one of the largest military bases in the southwestern United States. Her job was simple enough: filing documents, answering phones, and helping coordinate meetings between officers. But what made Sarah stand out wasn't her work ethic or her bright smile. It was the thick, jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline. The scar told a story that Sarah rarely shared with anyone. When she was 16, she had been in a terrible car accident. Her family was driving home from her younger brother's baseball game when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into their vehicle. Sarah's parents and brother walked away with minor injuries, but Sarah wasn't so lucky. A piece of twisted metal had torn through the passenger window and carved a deep gash across her face. The doctors had done their best to repair the damage, but the scar remained as a permanent reminder of that horrible night. Now, 7 years later, Sarah had learned to live with her appearance. She had tried makeup to cover the scar, but it was too prominent to hide completely. She had considered plastic surgery, but the cost was beyond her family's means. Eventually, she decided to embrace what made her different. The scar was part of her story, and she wouldn't let it define her limitations. Working at the military base should have been a fresh start for Sarah. She had moved to the area specifically for this job, hoping that in a professional environment, people would focus on her work rather than her appearance. Unfortunately, she quickly discovered that even adults could be cruel and childish. It started small at first. Sarah noticed some of the younger soldiers whispering when she walked by. She caught fragments of their conversations, words like Frankenstein and horror movie. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself that they were just immature kids who had never learned proper manners. But as weeks turned into months, the comments became bolder and more frequent. Lieutenant Danny Morrison was one of the worst offenders. He was 25 years old, fresh out of officer training, and convinced that his new rank gave him the right to say whatever he wanted. Morrison had a group of followers, mostly young enlisted men, who laughed at his jokes and encouraged his behavior. They would make comments about Sarah's appearance whenever she was within earshot, always loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough that they could claim they weren't talking to her directly. "Hey, did you see that new zombie movie?" Morrison would say as Sarah walked past. "The special effects were so realistic. I wonder how they did the makeup." His friends would burst into laughter, and Sarah would feel her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But she kept walking, kept her head high, and focused on her work. The harassment wasn't limited to Morrison's group. Other soldiers joined in, seeing it as harmless fun. They would make monster movie references, joke about Halloween coming early, or simply stare and whisper among themselves. Sarah began to dread walking through certain areas of the base, knowing that she would have to endure their comments and stares. Some of the female soldiers were even worse than the men. Sergeant Lisa Patterson, a tough-looking woman in her late 20s, seemed to take personal offense to Sarah's presence. Patterson had worked hard to earn respect in a male-dominated environment, and she saw Sarah as weak for not fighting back against the harassment. "If you can't handle a few jokes, maybe you shouldn't be working here," Patterson told her one day in the women's restroom. "This is the military, not a daycare center." Sarah wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, but she was afraid of making the situation worse. She needed this job, and she couldn't afford to be labeled as a troublemaker, so she endured the daily humiliation, hoping that eventually people would get bored and move on to someone else. The worst part wasn't even the direct insults. It was the way people would stop talking when she entered a room, or how conversations would suddenly shift when she approached. She could feel their eyes on her scar, could see them trying not to stare while simultaneously being unable to look away. The isolation was almost unbearable. Sarah's supervisor, Major Patricia Williams, was a kind woman who seemed genuinely concerned about Sarah's well-being. Williams had noticed the harassment but wasn't sure how to address it without making things worse for Sarah. "You know you can file a complaint, right?" Williams told her during one of their weekly check-ins. "What they're doing isn't acceptable." Sarah shook her head. "It's fine, ma'am. I can handle it." But Williams could see that it wasn't fine. Sarah had lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She seemed withdrawn and anxious, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding eye contact during conversations. The situation reached a breaking point on a humid Tuesday morning in July. Sarah was delivering some documents to the main briefing room when she overheard Morrison and his friends planning something. They were huddled around Morrison's desk, whispering and snickering like schoolboys. "It'll be hilarious," Morrison was saying. We'll get one of those fake scars from the costume shop and put it on Jenkins. Then we'll have him walk around mimicking her. She won't be able to say anything because technically we're not making fun of her directly." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had dealt with comments and stares, but this felt like a new level of cruelty. They were planning to turn her disfigurement into a performance, a joke for their entertainment. She hurried back to her desk, her hand shaking as she tried to focus on her work. Part of her wanted to confront them, to tell them how much their behavior hurt her. Another part wanted to run away, to find a new job somewhere else where people didn't know about her scar. But before she could decide what to do, word came down that Colonel James Harrison would be visiting the base for an inspection. Harrison was a legend in the military, a decorated war hero who had served multiple tours in combat zones and was known for his no-nonsense approach to leadership. He was also Sarah's last hope, though she didn't know it yet. The news of Harrison's visit sent the entire base into overdrive. Officers scrambled to prepare presentations. Enlisted personnel worked overtime to ensure everything was spotless, and everyone tried to make sure they would make a good impression on the distinguished visitor. Morrison and his group saw the colonel's visit as an opportunity for their prank. They figured that with all the chaos and preparation, no one would notice their little joke. They purchased the fake scar and convinced Private Jenkins to participate, promising him that it would be harmless fun. Sarah knew something was planned, but she didn't know exactly what. She could see the anticipation in Morrison's eyes, could hear the suppressed laughter in his group's conversations. She considered calling in sick on the day of the colonel's visit, but she couldn't afford to lose pay, and she didn't want to give them the satisfaction of driving her away. Colonel Harrison arrived on a Thursday morning, accompanied by his aide and several other high-ranking officers. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with steel grey hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his reputation preceded him into every room he entered. The morning inspection went smoothly. Harrison toured various facilities, reviewed procedures, and spoke with personnel at all levels. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who judged people by their actions rather than their appearance or background. Sarah tried to stay out of the way during the visit, focusing on her administrative duties and hoping to avoid any interaction that might draw unwanted attention. But fate had other plans. During the lunch break, Morrison's group put their plan into action. Private Jenkins, wearing the fake scar that closely resembled Sarah's real one, began walking through the administrative area, exaggerating his movements and making theatrical gestures. The other soldiers followed behind him, barely containing their laughter. "Oh, no, I'm so scary," Jenkins said in a falsetto voice, running his finger along the fake scar. "Everyone's afraid of the monster lady." The performance attracted attention from other personnel, and soon a small crowd had gathered to watch. Some people looked uncomfortable with what was happening, but no one spoke up to stop it. Sarah was at the copy machine when she heard the commotion. She turned around and saw Jenkins mocking her, saw the crowd of people laughing at his performance, and felt something break inside her. All the months of enduring their comments, all the times she had held her tongue and tried to be professional, suddenly seemed pointless. Tears began to flow down her cheeks and she couldn't stop them. She had promised herself she wouldn't let them see her cry, but the cruelty of the moment was too much to bear. She stood frozen, watching her trauma being turned into entertainment, feeling more alone and humiliated than she ever had in her life. And that was exactly when Colonel Harrison walked into the room. The colonel had been heading to Major Williams' office to discuss some administrative matters when he heard the laughter and commotion. He stepped into the administrative area just in time to see Jenkins' performance and Sarah's reaction. Harrison took in the scene immediately. The fake scar, the laughing crowd, the young woman with tears streaming down her face, and the real scar that matched the fake one being mocked. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Those who knew him well would have recognized the look. It was the same expression he wore right before making decisions that ended careers. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed the colonel's presence. Morrison, realizing that their prank had been discovered by the worst possible person, tried to signal Jenkins to stop, but it was too late. Harrison walked slowly through the crowd, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet room. He approached Jenkins, who was still wearing the fake scar, and looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized who was standing in front of him. "Soldier," Harrison said in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Remove that thing from your face." Jenkins fumbled with the fake scar, his hands shaking as he peeled it off. The adhesive left red marks on his skin, and he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Harrison took the fake scar from Jenkins and examined it closely. Then he looked at Sarah, taking note of her real scar and her tear-stained face. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped working. What happened next would be talked about on the base for years to come, and would change not just Sarah's life but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The Colonel's reaction was not what anyone expected, and it would leave the entire room speechless. Colonel Harrison stood in the center of the silent room, holding the fake scar between his fingers like it was a piece of evidence in a court-martial. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, studying each person in the crowd. Some looked ashamed, others defiant, and a few seemed confused about why the atmosphere had become so tense. Sarah remained frozen by the copy machine, her tears still falling, but her sobs now silent. I'd never felt so exposed, so humiliated. Part of her wished the ground would swallow her whole, while another part was grateful that finally, someone in authority had witnessed what she had been enduring. The Colonel's gaze finally settled on Lieutenant Morrison, who was trying to blend into the background behind his group of followers. Morrison's face had gone pale, and he was clearly calculating how much trouble he was in. "Lieutenant Morrison," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Step forward." Morrison hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly moved to the front of the group. His usual cocky demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who suddenly realized they had made a terrible mistake. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted a salute. Harrison didn't return the salute. Instead, he continued to study the fake scar in his hand. "Interesting piece of equipment, Lieutenant. Where did you acquire this?" Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It was just a joke, sir. We didn't mean any harm." "A joke," Harrison repeated, his tone flat and emotionless. "I see." He looked up from the fake scar and stared directly into Morrison's eyes. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly is humorous about mocking someone's appearance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, realizing that any answer he gave would only make things worse for him. We weren't trying to hurt anyone, sir. We were just having some fun." Harrison nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. Then he did something unexpected. He began to unbutton his dress uniform jacket. The room watched in confusion as the Colonel removed his jacket and then began to roll up the sleeve of his white uniform shirt. As the fabric moved up his arm, gasps echoed throughout the room. Colonel Harrison's left arm was covered in scars. Deep, jagged marks crisscrossed his skin from his wrist to his shoulder. Some were thin lines, others were thick, ropey patches of damaged tissue. It was clear that whatever had caused these scars had been traumatic and painful. "Afghanistan 2018, Harrison said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Roadside bomb. The explosion threw me 30 feet from my vehicle and embedded shrapnel throughout my left side. I spent 8 months in military hospitals, underwent 14 surgeries, and had to relearn how to use my arm." The room was utterly silent. Many of the people present had served under Harrison for years, but none of them had ever seen his scars. He had always worn long sleeves, even in the desert heat. Harrison continued rolling up his sleeve, revealing even more damaged tissue. "The doctors told me I would never regain full function. They said I should consider a medical discharge and find a desk job somewhere. They said my career was over." He looked directly at Morrison, who was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. "Would you like to make a joke about my scars, Lieutenant? Would you find it amusing to put on a fake version of my injuries and parade around the base for everyone's entertainment?" Morrison shook his head frantically. "No, sir. Absolutely not, sir." "Why not?" Harrison pressed. "According to you, scars are funny. There's something to be mocked and imitated for the amusement of others. So why not mine?" Morrison opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trapped by his own logic, and everyone in the room could see it. Harrison rolled his sleeve back down and began buttoning his jacket. "I'll tell you why, Lieutenant, because these scars represent something. They tell a story of sacrifice, of pain overcome, of battles fought and survived. Every mark on my body is a reminder of a moment when I chose to serve something greater than myself." He walked over to where Sarah was standing, and his expression softened slightly. "Ms. Martinez, may I ask how you received your scar?" Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue and tried to compose herself. Her voice was shaky but audible. Car accident, sir. 7 years ago. A drunk driver hit our family car. Harrison nodded respectfully. And I assume you weren't driving under the influence yourself? No, sir. I was just a passenger coming home from my brother's baseball game. So you were an innocent victim of someone else's poor choices.
You bear a permanent reminder of a traumatic event that was completely beyond your control.
Harrison's voice carried a note of empathy that surprised everyone present. He turned back to face the crowd, his expression hardening again. Every person in this room who participated in, encouraged, or simply stood by and watched this harassment should be ashamed of themselves. You have taken someone's trauma and turned it into your entertainment. You have made this young woman's workplace a hostile environment because of something she cannot control and did not choose. Major Williams, who had arrived during the colonel's speech, stepped forward. Sir, I've been documenting incidents of harassment, but Miss Martinez was reluctant to file formal complaints. Harrison looked at Williams, then at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, why didn't you report this behavior? Sarah hesitated, glancing nervously at Morrison and his group. I didn't want to cause trouble, sir. I need this job, and I was afraid that complaining would make things worse. Worse than having your trauma mocked in front of your co-workers? Harrison asked. Worse than coming to work every day knowing that people are making jokes about your appearance? Sarah considered his words. I guess I just hoped it would stop on its own. Harrison shook his head. Harassment never stops on its own, Miss Martinez. Bullies don't grow bored and move on. They escalate until someone with authority steps in and puts a stop to it. He faced the room again. I want everyone who was involved in this behavior to understand something. The United States military does not tolerate discrimination or harassment in any form. We are supposed to be professionals, trained to work together regardless of our differences in background, appearance, or personal circumstances. Morrison tried to speak up. Sir, with respect, we were just... Lieutenant, Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You will speak only when I ask you a direct question. Morrison's mouth snapped shut. Harrison continued his address to the room. Some of you seem to think that because someone looks different, they're fair game for your mockery. Let me share something with you about scars and the people who bear them. He paused, making eye contact with various people in the crowd. In my 30 years of military service, I have learned that scars are often indicators of strength, not weakness. The people who bear visible reminders of their struggles are often the ones who have overcome the most adversity. They have faced challenges that would break lesser individuals, and they have survived. Sarah felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. She had never heard anyone describe her scar in positive terms before. Harrison wasn't finished. Martinez, how old were you when you had your accident? 16, sir. 16 years old. Still a child, really. And yet you survived the traumatic accident that could have killed you. You endured the physical pain of recovery, the emotional trauma of the experience, and the ongoing social challenges of living with a visible scar. And despite all of that, you put yourself through school, found employment, and moved to a new city to start your career. He looked around the room. How many of you would have that kind of resilience? How many of you could face that level of adversity as a teenager and still come out fighting? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Harrison walked back to Morrison. Lieutenant, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Do you believe that Miss Martinez's scar makes her less valuable as a human being? Morrison's face was flushed with embarrassment. No, sir. Do you believe it makes her less capable at her job? No, sir. Do you believe it gives you the right to mock her, humiliate her, or make her feel unwelcome in her workplace? Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. No, sir. Harrison nodded. Good. Then we're making progress. He turned to address Private Jenkins, who had been the one wearing the fake scar. Private Jenkins, do you understand why what you did was wrong? Jenkins, who looked like he was about to be sick, nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't think about how it would hurt her feelings.
You didn't think,
Harrison repeated. That's exactly the problem. None of you thought about the human being you were hurting. You saw someone who looked different, and instead of showing compassion or simply minding your own business, you decided to make her pain into your entertainment. Sergeant Patterson, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, stepped forward. Sir, some of us felt that if Ms. Martinez couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe she wasn't tough enough for this environment. Harrison's gaze shifted to Patterson, and his expression grew even more serious. Sergeant, Are you suggesting that tolerance for harassment is a job requirement? Patterson seemed to realize she had made a mistake. No, sir, but because if that's the case, Harrison continued, then perhaps you're not familiar with military regulations regarding discrimination and hostile work environments. Should I have someone provide you with a refresher course? Patterson's face reddened. No, sir. That won't be necessary. Furthermore, Harrison said, his voice gaining intensity, the ability to endure harassment is not a measure of someone's toughness or professional capability. A person's worth is not determined by their willingness to accept mistreatment from their colleagues. He paused to let that sink in, then continued. In fact, I would argue that it takes more strength to come to work every day knowing you'll face mockery and harassment than it does to be part of the crowd doing the mocking. Martinez has shown more courage in the past few months than any of you have shown in this entire incident. Sarah felt a strange sensation in her chest. For the first time in years, someone was defending her. Someone was standing up for her in a way that no one ever had. She had spent so long accepting that her scar made her a target that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in her corner. Harrison addressed the entire room again. I'm going to make something very clear to all of you. This behavior stops today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Anyone who continues to harass Ms. Martinez or any other employee based on their appearance will face disciplinary action up to and including dismissal from service. He looked specifically at Morrison. Lieutenant, you and I will be having a private conversation after this gathering. Private Jenkins, Sergeant Patterson, and anyone else who participated in today's incident will also be meeting with me individually. Morrison's career was flashing before his eyes. He had heard stories about Colonel Harrison's disciplinary meetings. They were legendary for being thorough, intense, and career-ending. But Harrison wasn't finished with his address to the room. What he said next would surprise everyone present and change the dynamic of the entire situation. Colonel Harrison stood quietly for a moment, his eyes moving across the faces of everyone in the room. The silence stretched on, making people increasingly uncomfortable. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened, and he did something that no one saw coming. He walked over to Sarah and extended his hand to her. Ms.
Martinez, would you mind if I shared something personal with you and everyone else here? Sarah, still emotional but curious, nodded and shook his hand. Of course, sir. Harrison turned to address the room, but his voice had lost its sharp edge.
Instead, it carried a tone of vulnerability that none of them had ever heard from him before. When I was recovering from my injuries in the hospital, I went through a very dark period. The doctors had done what they could, but I was left with these scars, limited mobility in my left arm, and chronic pain that I still deal with every day. I was angry, bitter, and convinced that my life as I knew it was over. The room remained completely silent, everyone hanging on his every word. I had a nurse named Maria who worked the night shift. She was probably about Miss Martinez's age, and she had a birthmark that covered nearly half of her face. It was large, dark, and very noticeable. When I first met her, I'll admit that I was startled by her appearance. Harrison paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. But Maria was the kindest, most compassionate person I had ever encountered. She would sit with me during my worst nights when the pain was unbearable and I couldn't sleep. She would talk to me about her life, her dreams, her struggles. And slowly, I began to realize something important. He looked directly at Sarah. I stopped seeing her birthmark completely. When I looked at Maria, I saw someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others heal. I saw someone who brought comfort to people in their darkest moments. I saw someone who had probably faced ridicule and stares her entire life, yet had responded by becoming a person who made the world a better place. Sarah felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of recognition and gratitude. Harrison continued, Maria taught me that the way we respond to adversity defines who we are, far more than the adversity itself. She could have become bitter about her appearance, could have hidden away from the world, could have let other people's reactions make her cruel or defensive. Instead, she chose to be a healer. He gestured toward Sarah. Ms. Martinez, from what I've observed today and from what Major Williams has told me about your work, you've made a similar choice. Despite facing harassment and cruelty from people who should have been your colleagues and allies, you've continued to do your job professionally. You've continued to treat others with respect even when they weren't showing you the same courtesy.
Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue.
I just tried to do what my parents taught me, sir.
They said that how other people treat you says more about them than it does about you. Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. Your parents raised you well. And they were absolutely right. He turned back to face Morrison and the others who had participated in the harassment. His expression became serious again, but not as harsh as before. Now, I want all of you to understand something. I'm not just angry about what you did to Miss Martinez, though that behavior was completely unacceptable. I'm also disappointed because you've missed an opportunity. Morrison looked confused. An opportunity, sir? Yes, Lieutenant. You've worked alongside someone who has demonstrated remarkable resilience, professionalism, and grace under pressure. Instead of learning from her example, instead of recognizing her strength, you chose to make her a target. You turned someone who could have been a role model into a victim. Harrison began pacing slowly in front of the group. In combat, I've served with soldiers who had all kinds of visible and invisible scars. Burns, amputations, facial injuries, PTSD, depression, you name it. And I learned something important. The soldiers who had overcome significant personal challenges were often the most reliable, the most compassionate, and the most dedicated members of our unit. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Morrison. Do you know why that is, Lieutenant? Morrison shook his head. No, sir. Because when you've faced real adversity, when you've had to fight for every small victory in your life, you develop qualities that can't be taught in training. You develop genuine empathy for others who are struggling. You develop resilience that helps you push through when things get difficult. You develop a perspective that helps you focus on what's truly important. Harrison gestured towards Sarah again. Ms. Martinez has those qualities. She's been tested in ways that most of you haven't. And instead of recognizing that as a strength, you treated it as a weakness to be exploited. Private Jenkins, who had been silent since removing the fake scar, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, I never thought about it that way. I just went along with what everyone else was doing. Harrison nodded. That's part of the problem, Private. You didn't think. But more importantly, you followed the crowd instead of following your conscience. Tell me, when you were putting on that fake scar and preparing to mock Miss Martinez, did any part of you feel uncomfortable with what you were doing? Jenkins looked down at his feet. Yes, sir. But I didn't want to be the only one who didn't participate. I didn't want them to think I was weak or too sensitive. So you were afraid of being ostracized by your peers for doing the right thing, Harrison said. Do you understand the irony in that? You were worried about being treated poorly by your colleagues, so you helped them treat Miss Martinez poorly. The observation hit Jenkins like a physical blow. He had never made that connection before, but now it was glaringly obvious. Harrison addressed the entire room again. This is what I want all of you to understand. Harassment and bullying don't happen in a vacuum. They require participation, encouragement, and most importantly, they require bystanders who choose to do nothing. He looked around the room, making eye contact with various people. Every person who laughed at the jokes, every person who stood by and watched without speaking up, every person who made Miss Martinez feel isolated and unwelcome. You all played a role in creating a hostile work environment. Sergeant Patterson, who had been quiet since her earlier comment, spoke up. Sir, what should we have done? I mean, if we saw it happening again in the future? Harrison seemed pleased by the question. That's exactly the right question, Sergeant. The answer is simple. You speak up. You don't have to give a grand speech or file a formal complaint. You can simply say, that's not funny, or that's not appropriate. You can refuse to participate in the laughter. You can include the person being targeted in your conversations and activities. He paused to let that sink in. But most importantly, you can treat every person in this workplace with the respect and dignity they deserve as human beings and as your colleagues. Major Williams, who had been observing the entire interaction, stepped forward. Sir, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Harrison considered the question carefully. We're going to make some changes around here, Major. First, everyone in this room is going to attend sensitivity training. Not because I think you're all terrible people, but because clearly some of you need guidance on appropriate workplace behavior. He held up his hand to forestall any protests. Second, we're going to implement a zero-tolerance policy for harassment based on appearance, disability, or any other personal characteristic. This isn't just a Martinez.
This is about creating an environment where everyone can do their job without fear of ridicule or discrimination. Morrison, who had been silent for most of the discussion, finally spoke up. Sir, I want to apologize to you, to Miss Sack, Martinez, to everyone. I know I was wrong, and I know an apology doesn't undo what I did, but I need to say it anyway. Harrison studied Morrison's face, trying to determine if the apology was genuine. Lieutenant, apologizing is a good first step, but real change requires action, not just words. What are you prepared to do differently going forward? Morrison thought for a moment. I want to make things right, sir. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to try. Sarah, who had been mostly listening throughout the exchange, surprised everyone by speaking up. Lieutenant Morrison, I accept your apology, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me. There are probably other people on this base who are being treated poorly because of how they look or where they come from or what makes them different. What you do for them matters more than what you do for me. Her words had a profound impact on everyone in the room. Here was someone who had been the target of months of harassment, and instead of seeking revenge or demanding punishment, she was thinking about other potential victims. Harrison looked at Sarah with genuine admiration. Ms. Martinez, that is exactly the kind of leadership and compassion that this organization needs more of. He turned back to Morrison. Lieutenant, did you hear what Ms. Martinez just said? She's not asking for personal recompense. She's asking you to become the kind of person who protects others from what she went through. Are you prepared to make that commitment? Morrison nodded, and for the first time his expression seemed genuinely remorseful rather than just afraid. Yes, sir, I am. Harrison nodded approvingly, then addressed the entire room one final time. I want everyone here to remember this moment. Not because I want you to dwell on your mistakes, but because I want you to remember what real strength and character look like. He gestured towards Sarah. Ms. Martinez has shown more grace, professionalism, and leadership in the past hour than many of you have shown in months. She has every right to be angry, to demand apologies, to insist on punishment for those who harassed her. Instead, she's thinking about how to prevent other people from going through what she experienced. The room was completely silent as people absorbed his words. Harrison continued. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what it means to be a true professional. That is what it means to put the mission and the welfare of others ahead of your personal feelings. Ms. Martinez has demonstrated the exact qualities we claim to value in the military: honor, courage, and selfless service. He paused, then added, I hope all of you will learn from her example. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the colonel's words. For so long she had seen her scar as something that made her weak, something that made her a target. But Colonel Harrison had helped her see it differently, not as a weakness, but as evidence of her strength. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere on the base changed dramatically. Morrison, true to his word, became an advocate for respectful treatment of all personnel. He started calling out inappropriate behavior when he saw it, and his change in attitude influenced others in his group. Private Jenkins volunteered to help with diversity and inclusion initiatives, saying he wanted to understand better how to create a welcoming environment for everyone. Even Sergeant Patterson, who had initially been resistant to change, began to recognize that her tough love approach had actually been contributing to a hostile environment for people who were already struggling. Sarah found that people began approaching her differently. Instead of staring at her scar, they made eye contact. Instead of whispering about her appearance, they included her in conversations. Instead of treating her like an outsider, they began to see her as a valued member of the team. The most surprising change came from Colonel Harrison himself. Before leaving the base, he requested a private meeting with Sarah. Martinez, he said, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I have a proposition for you. Sarah looked curious.
What kind of proposition, sir?
I'm developing a new program for military personnel who have experienced trauma, both physical and emotional. We need someone who understands what it's like to overcome adversity, someone who can relate to people who are struggling with visible and invisible scars. Harrison paused. I'd like you to consider joining our team. It would mean additional training, probably some travel, and definitely more responsibility. But I think you have something special to offer. Sarah was stunned. A few weeks earlier, she had been considering quitting her job because of the harassment. Now, one of the most respected officers in the military was offering her an opportunity to help others. I don't know what to say, sir. I'm honored that you would consider me. Harrison smiled. Ms. Martinez, you've already proven that you have the most important qualifications for this kind of work. You've survived something difficult. You've maintained your compassion despite facing cruelty. And you've shown that you're more interested in helping others than in seeking revenge against those who hurt you. Sarah thought about all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering if she would ever find a place where she belonged, where people would see her for who she was rather than what had happened to her.
Yes, sir, she said finally.
I would be honored to join your team. As Sarah left the colonel's office that day, she caught her reflection in a window. For the first time in years, when she looked at her scar, she didn't see something shameful, or she saw evidence of survival, of strength, of a journey that had brought her to exactly where she needed to be. The harassment that had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her had ultimately led to an opportunity she never could have imagined. And the scar that had been a source of pain and mockery had become the foundation for a new career helping others heal. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the things that make us different are exactly the things that make us valuable. And sometimes, the cruelest moments in our lives can lead to the most meaningful opportunities to make a difference. Colonel Harrison had been right about one thing. Scars do tell a story, but it's not always the story people think they're reading. Sarah's scar told the story of survival, resilience, and ultimately, triumph. And now she was ready to help others write their own stories of healing and hope. The base never forgot what happened that day in the administrative office. It became a turning point, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who witnessed it. They learned that real strength isn't about mocking those who are different, it's about standing up for them. They learned that true leadership isn't about using your position to tear others down, it's about lifting them up. And they learned that sometimes the person you think is the weakest in the room might actually be the strongest one there. Years later, when people talked about Colonel Harrison's visit to Fort Henderson, they didn't remember the inspection reports or the meetings with officers. They remembered the day he taught them that courage isn't the absence of scars, it's what you choose to do with them.